Whether you're a newbie to private 5G or whether you've been around the block, a conversation with Mehmet always uncovers deeper insights into this incredible technology. Hi everyone, welcome to the first episode of CTO Lectures by Celona. My name is Pradyum Ramkumar and I'm Head of Product Marketing here at Celona. I'll be joined in this series by our CTO, Mehmet Yavuz, and we together will dive deep into the commercial, technical, and the deployment aspects of private 5G. In this episode, we will attack a very important topic, making sense of global spectrum landscape for private 5G. As many of you might already understand, spectrum is critical for private 5G deployment. And as more and more companies, multinational companies in particular, deploy private 5G, you need spectrum availability not just in the US but globally. In today's episode, we've invited Mehmet to discuss this particular topic. Without further ado, let's welcome Mehmet. Hey Mehmet, welcome to the show. Before we get started, why don't you introduce a little bit about yourself?
Of course. Hi everyone, it's my pleasure to be talking to you today. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Celona, and at Celona my focus is defining the technology vision for our innovative end-to-end 5G solutions for enterprises. I've been in wireless communications almost for 30 years. Previously, I served as the CTO of Ruckus, and I was also VP of engineering at Qualcomm corporate R&D for about 15 years. And at Qualcomm, I spearheaded some initiatives such as cellular small cells and private cellular networks and 5G for industrial applications. And of course, spectrum is the lifeblood of wireless networks. So one of the key areas of my focus at Celona is wireless spectrum availability globally, especially for private 5G deployments.
That's great. Glad to have you on the show, Mehmet. So why don't you help us understand how successful CBRS has been? CBRS was launched in 2018 and, people have been using it to deploy various end use cases and applications. Can you share a little bit about how it's been going?
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, CBRS was launched in 2018 and it was fully commercial in 2019, right? So over the last 6 years or so, we had a lot of commercial deployments in the CBRS band. And this spectrum has been used for many wireless network deployments over the years, including fixed wireless, broadband, even some regular mobile wireless broadband. But for me, the most exciting use has been enterprise private 5G network deployments, right? So over the years, we have seen a lot of deployments in oil and gas, petrochemicals, warehouses, distribution centers, and manufacturing environments. And these private 5G deployments, mainly the use cases were around connected workers, AGVs, all those mission-critical industrial use cases. For example, in oil and gas, we have a lot of deployments for connected workers with their tablets and handheld devices for providing this large, wide area coverage, but also in warehouses, manufacturing environments, we see a lot of indoor deployments too. So overall, there are like hundreds of deployments in these environments today, and we see that typically we get around 100 to 120 megahertz of CBRS spectrum available for each of these sites, and that fuels these mission-critical wireless services, both indoors and outdoors. Another area that I want to highlight is it's very exciting and it's more recent, is the introduction of neutral host services, which is based on MACN, multi-operator core network architecture in the CBRS band. And in these deployments, we provide the public cellular coverage for operators like AT&T and T-Mobile. And for neutral hosts, we see a lot of uptake in the healthcare, higher education, retail, industrial verticals, and we expect these deployments to further expand to general office buildings and so forth. So these neutral host deployments are basically pushing CBRS band into the carpeted enterprise type locations, right? And these deployments are generally in urban, suburban areas, and one can argue that there will be more CBRS deployments in the vicinity and potential interference and so forth. But note that these neutral host deployments are mostly indoors, and frankly, over the last year plus, we don't see much interference from other CBRS networks in these areas too, and typically also get about 100, 120 megahertz of spectrum available for neutral host as well.
So, Mehmet, I think when you talk to carriers, many of them want to use licensed spectrum for the same use cases versus CBRS, which is unlicensed spectrum. How do you look at the two spectrums in this particular context, both for neutral host as well as private use cases?
Yeah, honestly, we've been hearing this for a while, but the actual data doesn't really support this, right? As I mentioned, there are like hundreds of private 5G deployments so far, and there are tens of neutral host deployments that has been in place. And according to Ongo Alliance, actually, there are about 500,000 CBSDs already deployed in US in CBRS band. And we don't see any noticeable interference issues in these commercial deployments at this point. So I would say we don't really need separate license spectrum for the private 5G or neutral host type deployments.
What is going on from a CBRS standpoint? What is the next level of innovation? What is the Ongo Alliance providing its users?
Yeah, this is a great question, right? The CBRS band employs quite a few novel methods to ensure the efficient use of the spectrum while protecting the incumbent users, such as military radars, right? Initially, these methods were quite conservative to protect the incumbents, but over the years, these protection methods have been further relaxed to make the spectrum more available, right? More spectrum available in more places. So, in fact, the CBRS 2.0 was announced late last year, and it brought in some very specific enhancements, right? First of all, as many of the folks may know, CBRS has some protection areas defined in the coastal regions. And this means that CBRS deployments in these coastal regions are subject to reduced spectrum in case there's incumbents in these areas. So for example, out of 150 megahertz spectrum, you may have 20 megahertz available for the military radars and so forth, and only remaining is available for CBRS. But with CBRS 2.0, these protection areas are further reduced. So very small areas on the coastal areas are left for protection. Secondly, the heartbeat timer was extended, right? So what does this mean? Basically, each CBRS radio or AP need to send a heartbeat to the spectrum access system. And originally, this was every 5 minutes. Now with CBRS 2.0, we can operate up to 24 hours without needing to reauthorize the spectrum from the spectrum access system. So this means even if the backhaul is lost for a few hours at a certain site, CBRS can continue to operate. And ultimately, this improves reliability and reduces potential service interruptions. And the third major improvement relates to the coexistence between different CBRS deployments, right? As I mentioned earlier, there's ever increased number of deployments in the CBRS, and most of these deployments are in so-called GAA, General Authorized Access Layer of the CBRS band. And the CBRS 2.0 brings a new GAA coexistence framework, and this framework enhances the sharing among the users, GAA users, like amongst different deployments, and it leads to more efficient use of the spectrum. So all of these enhancements introduced in CBRS 2.0 really make CBRS band more efficient and future-proof. And actually, I want to show you these coastal areas that I mentioned to you earlier, right? This is the visual representation of that first enhancement. So you can see the original protection zones in the purple color where the CBRS spectrum may be reduced, right, from 150 to maybe 130 or so if there's an incumbent. With CBRS 2.0, these zones are further reduced to these just white lines that you see, which is essentially all the way to the coast. So only very small regions are now left for the protection area. So essentially, all 150 megahertz is available for the whole US.
Cool.
So the other aspect I want to highlight is, of course, more spectrum is always better, right? So now there is new discussion underway to make even more spectrum available on a shared basis. And again, the CBRS is 3.55 to 3.7 gigahertz. And now this new spectrum from 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz is under consideration. So this is a very premium 250 megahertz of spectrum. And the only catch is that this 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz is currently being used by the military radars, right? So just like in CBRS, the usage of this spectrum by the incumbents is important, but it's very limited, right? The military usage is typically on a very small part of the region, and it's only a small part of this 250 megahertz spectrum. So this spectrum band is very suitable to be shared, used on a shared basis, like the CBRS band, and of course give priority to the incumbents. So there are lots of ongoing discussions about how exactly the sharing mechanisms should be implemented. But we believe that a method similar to CBRS can be implemented here and ensure that this band is opened up to commercial users like private 5G while still protecting the incumbent users like the military radars.
That's great. So, a lot of different use cases on CBRS, and the OnGo Alliance is enabling so many more ways for people to use the spectrum, providing new spectrum. So, very, very exciting. But when you look at deployments outside US, say I'm a multinational company,
Mhm.
I have some manufacturing facilities in the US, but I also want to have a similar strategy outside the US. So what's going on there? Maybe you can help shed some light on that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very critical question, right? Many of our customers are multinational companies. They like to make sure that they can have spectrum available for their P5G deployments in all countries they operate. For example, our oil and gas customers, they have refineries across the globe in many countries, and they want to have P5G spectrum in all of these countries. And the good news is that there are ever increasing number of countries with private 5G spectrum allocated by their local regulators, right? Here's a map of countries where private 5G spectrum is available. So on the left, of course, there's US, but now you have Canada and Brazil shown in blue. In the middle, you see a lot of countries in Europe. That spectrum, so-called N77, which is 3.8 to 4.2, essentially in France, Belgium, UK, Poland, Norway. Now N78, which is the adjacent frequency similar to CBRS in many countries like Germany, Ireland, Netherlands, Sweden, and so forth. And in Asia, you have Korea and Japan, and you have Australia. And there are all these countries where there's private 5G spectrum similar to CBRS. Now, the method of accessing this spectrum can differ a little bit. For example, in Germany, you need to fill out an application to the regulator for a specific location. It may be a factory, for example, and in a few weeks, you get the spectrum allocated. The mechanics of how you get the spectrum may change, may differ a little bit from country to country, but essentially the regulators are basically giving those spectrum for a very small fee, very nominal fee for specific areas owned by these different industries through a well-established process.
That's
So
great.
yeah.
So it is different from SaaS, right? Like the United States uses SaaS, there's a sharing protocol. So you're saying that in places like US where there's a sharing protocol, whereas in some other countries there might be, you might just outright get that spectrum from the regulator. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you get the spectrum directly allocated by the regulator, and all you do is typically fill out an application form online, and you need to put, name of the company, the specifics of the region, right? Maybe, for example, a refinery or a factory where you need the spectrum, and you send your application. You pay the fee, which may be like a couple hundred euros or something, and then in a few weeks you get specific spectrum allocated for that area for like 5+ years for the use in that specific region.
A follow-up question on that. Does Celona do this or does the customer have to do it themselves? Like how does it work?
Yeah, I mean, we work with our customers, right? In many countries, the application is done by the end customer or our channel partner because they need to have a tax ID and so forth. But we guide them, right? We do a joint partnership in terms of how to fill out that application and guide the partners and customers in terms of, sending that application. but it's pretty well established in most of these countries. There are a few more countries they're opening up, so this list is ever growing, right? This year, for example, we expect private 5G spectrum to open up in Portugal, Spain, and Poland as some of the countries. There may be a few others, honestly, but there will be more, right? More countries will be opening up special dedicated spectrum for private 5G. And we are, working with the regulators and providing them some assistance as needed in different places. But this is an ever-increasing list.
That's great. So again, so far what Mehmet covered are countries where countries are actually opening up private spectrums. But candidly, our customers can go anywhere. They might land up in places which
Yeah.
are not covered in this country. And Mehmet, the question to you in that case is, how, if the country regulator has not opened up private spectrum, how is Celona helping those customers get spectrum in the countries that you have not shown here?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And again, you see all these countries in blue where we have private 5G spectrum that is already available, right? But obviously there are a bunch of areas white outside of those blue regions, right? So for those regions, basically, we work with the mobile network operators, right? In those countries, we have established relationship with the operators to secure 5G spectrum for these private 5G deployments. And this map shows the countries in yellow that we have already secured spectrum, right? You can see Mexico, you can see Middle East, Asia, for example, China. We already established those relationships with some operators to secure spectrum because these are the countries that our current customers ask us to deploy private 5G. But as needed by our customers, we have an ever-increasing list of countries to get spectrum. Like at Celona, we work with global enterprises, right, to develop a roadmap for their private 5G deployments. And for each country, we secure spectrum either through private 5G, through the formal application, or through partnership with mobile network operators. So this is showing all the countries that we are active right now, right? And we have spectrum allocated for the deployments. And for our customers who need any other country, we have a pretty well-established method to work with mobile network operators if there's no P5G spectrum in that country. And so we kind of keep adding additional countries as needed. And again, we are actively advocating for the private 5G spectrum bands to open up so that we don't even need to, work with any specific operator in a country so that everything is already kind of automated.
Sounds great, Mehmet. Sounds like a good strategy. Let's talk about the frequency bands, right? Again, when you're
Yeah.
looking at devices or when you're looking at radios that are specified for a particular country, how are these bands shaping up? Maybe are they using common bands? What are the types of bands that they're using?
Yeah. So, I mean, here we are showing the specific frequency bands, right, for each country. And it's kind of alphabetical, but essentially the point is going from Australia all the way to United States, you see that these frequency bands really fall within 3.3 to 4.9 gigahertz. And that's like the main so-called mid-band for 5G. These are all 5G spectrum bands available for many devices. Honestly, bulk of the 5G deployments globally fall into this spectrum band, that so-called mid-band. So pretty much all the devices, mobile devices out there, from the tablets to smartphones to CPEs and gateways, they all support this mid-band frequency.
Okay, and if you're curious about which devices support what band, definitely visit our website, celona.io/devices, which will give you a little more insight into whether it's a Zebra device or an Apple device, what are the bands they support, because we do comprehensive testing across various bands on these devices. One point when I see this chart, Mehmet, is I mean, you always tell me that even for a neutral host type application, the band allocation for CBRS in the US is actually very advantageous from a carrier coverage standpoint in building. Can you maybe spend a couple minutes just explaining that?
Yeah. I mean, basically, one of the advantage that we bring is the local deployment, right? many times in these mid bands, if you have a macro base station that's deployed outside on a tower and so forth, it's very hard for the signals to penetrate inside the buildings, right? Or inside the warehouses or inside the offices or hospitals. That's why the traditional way of deploying cellular technology using outside towers has limited capability because of the mid-band spectrum. But what we do is we deploy private 5G or neutral host radios inside the facility, right? It may be inside an hospital as a neutral host, or it might be inside a warehouse, or it may even be in a refinery, but we put these outdoor base stations. So we can bring the network infrastructure very close to the end users, and that allows us to provide great capacity and performance and coverage for those end users. So that's the other key benefit that we bring with private 5G and neutral host to the end customers.
Yeah, so actually mid-band is actually the best spectrum that you can actually expect for an application like this. And the very fact that all these countries are offering mid-band spectrum is advantageous for any kind of private 5G deployment.
Absolutely.
Let's kind of maybe look at what is your future prediction for spectrum availability and P5G of the future. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So that's very interesting thing that we constantly monitor and see how things evolve, right? Of course, we talked about the 3.1 to 3.4, right, in US. And I didn't get a chance to mention this, but the whole so-called 6 gigahertz spectrum from 5.9 to 7.1 is also designated for 5G. Of course, there's Wi-Fi 6E and Wi-Fi 7 that's being deployed in this band in many countries, but there are also some countries like China, 5G is deployed in this frequency band. And there are discussions about 5G getting deployed in this band in Europe and even US as well. So in the coming months and few years, we'll see how 5G expands into the 6 gigahertz across the globe. And of course, there's the 6G, where there's a lot of design going on right now, and there are lots of new spectrum bands opening up for 6G. And here I'm just showing the three main chunks of frequencies of interest in 6G. One is 7.1 to 8.4, the other is 10.7 to 13.2, and then the third one is the 14, 15 gigahertz. So all these additional spectrum bands will be coming with 6G as well. So I don't foresee any lack of spectrum as we evolve over the years, right, with these P5G and neutral host deployments.
But still, the mid-band is the sweet spot, as we had covered in the last one, right?
Yeah, I think that will establish itself as the baseline for all of these deployments, right? And these additional spectrum bands will probably be supplemental, right, to provide even more capacity for these deployments. But the mid-band is going to be the workhorse, essentially, for these P5G and neutral host deployments.
That sounds great. So a lot of spectrum is available, device ecosystem is catching up, but I know we hit upon some of the use cases in the beginning of the session. Maybe can you help us understand, what are you most excited about in terms of applications, use cases, and what is the market telling you in terms of where these technologies are going to get deployed?
Yeah. I mean, we have been doing a lot of analysis and we work with like SNS and other partners in terms of looking into the future of these deployments. So for the private 5G, I mean, as of last year, the market was around 3.6 billion, and it was in those industrial verticals that I showed you. So the key growth segments that we see moving forward is the manufacturing, warehousing, oil and gas, transportation, and mining, right? Those will be the five key verticals that will keep driving the P5G. And we expect around 19% year-over-year growth, and that will take us to about 6 billion market size by 27 and about 11 billion by 2030. So that's a huge growth that we see happening right in front of our eyes in the private 5G segment, right? Now, also, if you remember, we said the other part of the growth is neutral host. And That is about a $2 billion market today. And we see that increasing similarly, maybe around 16% year-over-year growth based on SNS predictions. And the growth in the neutral host essentially will be in the verticals such as healthcare, retail, higher ed, and commercial buildings, including hospitality. So that is the growth that we are seeing in the neutral host area. So when you combine the two, we expect a huge growth in this area using all these private 5G spectrum options that we mentioned.
That's great. So you showed growth in private, you showed growth in carpeted space as well as uncarpeted space, and also all the spectrum available and all the developments that are going on in spectrum. So it looks like a really, really exciting next several years for the private 5G and neutral host industry.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the good news is there won't be any lack of spectrum in these upcoming, deployments and the growth that we see ahead of us. I think global deployments will be a huge boost in many regions in addition to US.
That's great, Mehmet. Well, thank you, Mehmet, for sharing your insights on the spectrum.
Sure.
Always happy to have you here. So, a little bit more about where you can go to learn more. We do a live product tour. So, if you're interested in private 5G or neutral host and you want to see a live demo, please click on the link here, scan the QR code, or go to our website and sign up for a live product tour. If you're really interested in some of the insights Mehmet shared today, we have a version of the SNS Telecom report on our website. We call it the State of Private 4G, 5G Market. You can download those reports. And, of course, in order to schedule a meeting with Celona, go to celona.io/contact. Again, thank you all for joining the show today. We'll make this a video series, and pick on Mehmet's brain for some other idea now. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Looking forward to more sessions.